The wind screaming through the Bitterroot Mountains didn't freeze Haley Caldwell's blood, but the sight of the woman stepping off the St. Louis stagecoach nearly did. He had sent for a sturdy, broad-shouldered widow to help skin pelts and survive the brutal Idaho winter. Instead, out stepped a vision in ruined emerald silk, clutching a velvet carpetbag like it was a shield. Her eyes, sharp as shattered glass, met his, and in that single, breathless second, Haley knew his quiet, isolated life was over. He expected a cold, practical marriage. He had no idea this desperate, beautiful stranger was about to set his entire world on fire. The mud-rutted streets of Oak Haven, Idaho Territory, were drowning in the late October slush. Haley Caldwell stood on the boardwalk outside the assayer's office, a towering figure clad in buckskin and thick bear fur, his breath pluming in the frigid air. At 32, Haley had the rugged, weathered look of a man who preferred the company of timber wolves to townspeople. He was a trapper, a veteran of the bloody campaigns of the 60s, and a man who had intentionally carved out a solitary existence high in the unforgiving peaks of the Bitterroots. But a man could only endure so many winters alone before the silence began to drive him mad. He needed a partner, not a lover, not a romantic ideal, but a partner. 6 months prior, he had placed an advertisement in a St. Louis Gazette seeking a wife. The letters he had received in return from a woman named Abigail Hodges had been pragmatic and devoid of sentiment. She wrote of her ability to mend clothes, butcher a hog, and tolerate the cold. She was 40, widowed, and plain. Haley had sent the stagecoach fare, expecting a sturdy pioneer woman to arrive on the 3 o'clock stage. When the heavy Concord coach finally rumbled to a halt outside the way station, the station master, an old, tobacco-chewing man named Jebediah Higgins, yanked the door open. Haley stepped forward, his jaw set. He waited for Abigail Hodges. Instead, a delicate black leather boot emerged, sinking immediately into the freezing mud. Then came a woman who looked like she had been violently torn from a high society ballroom. Her emerald green silk dress was stained with weeks of travel dirt, the lace at her collar frayed, and her dark auburn hair was escaping its pins in wild, defiant curls. She was young, perhaps no older than 24, with a face that belonged in a painted portrait, not the harsh frontier. She looked terrified, exhausted, and desperately out of place. Haley froze. He looked at Jebediah, who merely shrugged, spitting a stream of brown juice into the street. The woman looked around, her pale green eyes scanning the rough-hewn faces of the miners and loggers who were already staring at her with predatory interest. She tightened her grip on her velvet carpetbag. "I am looking for Mr. Haley Caldwell," she announced. Her voice was surprisingly steady, carrying the clipped, refined vowels of the East. Haley stepped off the boardwalk, his massive frame dwarfing her. "I'm Caldwell, but you aren't Abigail Hodges." The woman looked up at him, a flicker of genuine intimidation crossing her features as she took in his scarred cheek and the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his thigh. But she didn't step back. "Abigail Hodges contracted cholera in Kansas City," she said, her voice dropping lower. "Meant only for him. She did not survive the journey. I acquired her ticket and her correspondence. My name is Josephine Mercer." Haley stared at her, the wind whipping his dark hair. "You stole a dead woman's ticket. I repurposed it," Josephine corrected, lifting her chin. "Mr. Caldwell, I am fully aware I am not the stout widow you bargained for, but I am here. I am entirely out of funds, and if you leave me in this town, I will likely be dead or worse by nightfall. Honor your arrangement with Abigail, and I promise you will not regret it." It was a bold, desperate bluff. Haley could see the slight tremor in her hands. He should have turned her away. He should have given her $20 and pointed her toward the local boarding house. But the desperation in her eyes mirrored a survival instinct he recognized all too well. "The ride up the mountain takes 2 days," Haley grunted, turning toward where his 2-pack mules were tied. If you complain about the cold, I'll turn around and leave you on the trail." "I won't complain," she said fiercely. They were married within the hour by a drunken justice of the peace in the back room of the town saloon. The ceremony was entirely devoid of warmth. Haley recited the vows with a flat, mechanical tone. Josephine's voice trembled only once. When Haley slid a plain iron ring purchased hastily from the general store onto her slender, elegant finger, he felt how icy her skin was. The journey up the mountain was a grueling descent into a frozen hell. The elevation climbed sharply, the pine trees growing denser, the air thinner and biting. Haley rode his roan gelding, leading the mules, while Josephine rode a borrowed, sway-backed mare. For the first 4 hours, they didn't speak a word. Haley kept looking back, expecting to see her weeping or falling from the saddle. Instead, he saw her gripping the pommel with white-knuckled determination, her delicate silk dress offering no protection against the slicing wind. By the time they made camp that evening, she was shivering so violently she could barely dismount. Haley built a fire with practiced efficiency. He tossed a heavy wool blanket at her. "Wrap up. Drink this," he ordered, handing her a tin cup of bitter black coffee. Josephine took it with numb, trembling fingers. She took a sip, grimaced at the taste, but drank it all. She looked at the dark, looming shapes of the towering pines surrounding them. "It's so vast," she whispered, almost to herself. "It's empty," Haley corrected, sitting across the fire from her, cleaning his rifle. "Empty and unforgiving. If you don't pay attention, it will kill you. Why are you really here, Josephine? Women in silk dresses don't flee into the bitterroots just for the scenery." Josephine's eyes snapped to his, guarded and sharp. "I told you. I needed a way west." "You're running," Haley stated flatly. "From a man, the law, or a debt? That is my private business," she replied coldly. "You wanted a wife to maintain your household. I will do that. My past is not part of the contract." Haley chuckled, a harsh, humorless sound. "Out here, secrets have a way of getting people killed, but keep them if you want. Just don't let them follow you to my cabin." They reached the cabin late the next afternoon. It was a sturdy, brutalist structure of heavy logs, chinked with mud and moss, sitting on a ridge that overlooked a sweeping, snow-dusted valley. It was completely isolated. The nearest neighbor was 50 miles away. Josephine stood in the center of the single room. The floor was packed dirt. A cast-iron stove dominated one corner, a rough-hewn table the other. In the back was a single bed, covered in heavy furs. It was primitive, smelling of smoke, dried herbs, and tanned leather. "This is it," Haley said, dropping her carpet bag onto the table. Josephine slowly removed her ruined hat. She looked at the dirt floor, then at the single bed, and finally at Haley. She swallowed hard, the reality of her decision crashing down upon her. "I see. I'll sleep on a bedroll near the stove," Haley offered, sensing her sudden, profound panic. "Like I said, this was a business arrangement. You tend the cabin, cook the meals, mend the gear while I run my trap lines. We stay out of each other's way." "Agreed?" she whispered. That night, as the wind howled around the cabin, rattling the thick wooden shutters, Haley lay awake on the hard floor. He listened to the soft, rhythmic breathing of the city girl in his bed. He gave her exactly 2 weeks before she broke down and begged to be taken back to civilization. The first blizzard of the season hit 3 days later, burying the cabin under 3 feet of snow and dropping the temperature to 20 below zero. The world outside became a blinding, screaming expanse of white. Inside, the tension was thick enough to cut with a hunting knife. Haley was trapped indoors, forced to mend traps by the fire. Josephine, to his immense surprise, did not sit in the corner and weep. Instead, she attacked the cabin chores with a ferocious, if entirely uneducated, determination. Her first attempt at cooking a venison stew resulted in a scorched, blackened mass that tasted of charcoal and bitter roots. Haley ate it without a word, his face utterly impassive, though his stomach churned. When he went outside to fetch firewood, he found her struggling
This
with the
story
heavy
was
iron
posted on the
axe,
channel The
trying
Rusty
to split
Saddle.
a frozen
Please do
log.
not repost
She
it
had
in any
blistered
form.
her soft hands, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she refused to stop. "Give me that," Haley grunted, stepping up behind her and taking the axe handle. His large hands brushed hers, and she flinched, stepping away as if burned. Haley efficiently split the wood in 4 powerful strokes. "You hold it too tight. Let the weight of the axe head do the work, not your shoulders." Josephine rubbed her blistered palms, her pride wounded. "I will learn." "You'll have to," Haley said, his voice softer than he intended. He looked at her hands. "There's some bear grease in the tin by the window. Put it on those blisters before they tear open." As the days turned into weeks, a strange, silent rhythm developed between them. Haley watched her transform. The delicate Street Lewis socialite was shedding her velvet skin. She learned to start a fire from embers, to skin a rabbit without ruining the meat, and to bake dense, heavy bread in the Dutch oven. She worked until she was exhausted, falling asleep the moment her head hit the pillow. But it was during the evenings that the ice between them began to crack. With nothing but the firelight and the howling wind for company, silence became too heavy a burden. Haley, a man who had gone months without speaking a word, found himself wanting to hear her voice. "You read," Haley noted one evening, watching her meticulously turn the pages of a small, leather-bound volume she had brought in her carpet bag. Josephine looked up. "Poetry. Lord Byron. It reminds me of a different world." "Read it aloud," Haley said, startling himself. She hesitated, then began to read. Her voice filled the small, rough cabin, weaving tales of dark seas and doomed romances. Haley listened, mesmerized not just by the words, but by the cadence of her voice, the way the firelight caught the auburn strands of her hair. He found himself staring at the soft curve of her neck, feeling a dangerous, unfamiliar pull in his chest. He ruthlessly shoved the feeling down. She was a business partner, a temporary fixture. The turning point came in mid-November. The skies had cleared, leaving the mountains glistening under a harsh, brilliant sun. Haley had gone down to the lower timberline to check a snare line, leaving the mules tied to a sturdy pine near the edge of a ravine. He was kneeling in the snow, resetting a heavy steel trap when the wind shifted. The sharp, musky scent hit his nose a second before he heard the low, guttural growl. Timber wolves. A pack of them, driven mad by early starvation. Haley spun around, his hand flying to the colt at his hip, but they weren't after him. They were circling the panicked mules, 5 massive, gray-furred beasts. Haley drew his revolver and fired a warning shot into the air, but the wolves were desperate. One lunged, sinking its teeth into the roan's flank. The mule screamed, kicking wildly. Haley sprinted forward, shouting, firing again, hitting a smaller wolf in the shoulder. But as he ran across the uneven, snow-covered ground, his boot caught an exposed, ice-slicked root. He went down hard, his knee twisting with a sickening pop. The revolver flew from his grasp, sliding into a deep snowdrift. He tried to stand, but agony flared through his leg, pinning him to the ground. The alpha wolf, a massive black-tipped male, turned away from the mules and locked eyes with Haley. The beast bared its yellow teeth, lowering its head to charge. Haley, unarmed and crippled, reached for his hunting knife, knowing it would be a losing battle. Crack! The booming roar of a heavy rifle echoed through the valley, so loud it shook the snow from the pine branches above. The alpha wolf jerked violently, a spray of red erupting from its chest, and collapsed mid-stride, dead before it hit the snow. The remaining wolves scattered, terrified by the thunderous noise, vanishing into the tree line. Haley lay in the snow, stunned. He slowly turned his head toward the ridge, leading back to the cabin. Standing there, waist-deep in a snowdrift, was Josephine. She was wearing his oversized canvas coat, the massive Sharps buffalo rifle pressed against her shoulder. Smoke was still curling from the barrel. She racked the lever, chambering another massive round with surprising practiced ease, her eyes scanning the tree line for returning threats. Haley stared at her, utterly bewildered. The Sharp's rifle kicked like a mule. It took significant strength just to hold it steady, let alone fire it with lethal accuracy at 50 yards. Josephine lowered the rifle and began trudging down the hill toward him, her face pale but fiercely set. She reached him, dropping to her knees in the snow. "Are you bitten?" she demanded, her hands flying over his coat, checking for blood. "No," Haley rasped, wincing as he shifted his knee. "Just busted my leg." "Where in God's name did you learn to shoot a buffalo rifle like that?" Josephine met his gaze, the remnants of adrenaline flushing her cheeks. "My father was a military man before he became a banker. He believed his daughters should know how to defend themselves. I told you, Haley, I'm not helpless." Haley looked at the dead wolf, then back at his wife. The image of the frail, ruined woman stepping off the stagecoach vanished entirely, replaced by the fierce, capable woman kneeling in the snow before him. Something shifted in his chest, a heavy iron door swinging open. "Help me up," he grunted. She wrapped his massive arm around her shoulders, bearing his weight with a grunt of exertion. Together, they managed to limp back to the cabin. That night, Josephine cut away his trousers to examine the knee. It was badly swollen, but not broken. She bound it tightly with torn strips of linen and brewed a strong willow bark tea for the pain. Haley sat on the edge of the bed, watching her as she worked by the firelight. Her hair had escaped its braid, falling in a curtain around her face. She looked exhausted, her hands still smeared with gun oil and snow. "You saved my life today, Josie," Haley said quietly, using the nickname for the first time. She paused, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. She looked at him, and for the first time, there was no guard in her eyes, just a weary, genuine vulnerability. "You would have done the same for me." "It's more than that," Haley said, his voice a low rumble. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers gently touching her cheek, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Josephine didn't flinch away. She froze, her breath hitching, her eyes widening as she stared into his dark, intense gaze. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thick, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Haley leaned in, moving slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. When his lips met hers, it wasn't cold or practical. It was desperate, hungry, and entirely consuming. Josephine let out a soft sound, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his shirt, pulling him closer, kissing him back with a fiery intensity that matched his own. The marriage of convenience burned to ash in that single moment, replaced by a roaring, undeniable fire. By January, the cabin in the Bitterroots felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Haley's knee healed slowly, forcing him to spend more time indoors. It was a blessing in disguise. He and Josie became inseparable. The physical passion between them was a wild, consuming thing, matching the untamed wilderness around them. But it was the emotional intimacy that caught Haley off guard. He found himself telling her about the war, about the bloody fields of Shiloh, and the ghosts that still haunted his sleep. She listened, holding him in the dark, offering no pity, only a quiet, unyielding strength that anchored him. In return, Josie finally unburdened herself. One night, wrapped in a thick quilt by the glowing stove, she told him the truth. "My father worked for a man named Elias Sterling," Josie said, staring into the flames. "He's a financier in St. Louis, railroads, mostly. But his empire is built on blood and fraud. He bribes politicians, hires thugs to burn out competing farmers, and steals land. My father discovered the discrepancies in the ledgers. He was going to take them to the federal marshals." Josie's voice broke. She closed her eyes. "Sterling found out. He had his men stage a robbery. They shot my father in the street. I knew they would come for me next. to tie up loose ends. So, I broke into my father's safe, took the true ledgers, and ran. Sterling controls the
This
police
story
in
was
Street
posted on the
Lewis.
channel The
I
Rusty
couldn't go
Saddle.
to them.
Please do
I
not
bought
repost
Abigail
it in any
Hodges'
form.
ticket because I knew Elias would be looking for Josephine Mercer on the train manifests. Haley's jaw clenched, a dangerous, protective fury rising in his chest. Where are the ledgers now? In my carpet bag, Josie whispered, sewn into the lining. I thought if I could get far enough away, I could mail them anonymously to a federal judge in Chicago. Haley pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. Sterling won't find you here. The snow is 10 feet deep in the passes. No one is coming up this mountain until the spring thaw. And by then, we'll figure out a way to handle this. You're mine now, Josie. No one touches you. It was a promise Haley intended to keep with his life, but he had underestimated the reach of a man with limitless wealth. In late February, the bitter cold broke for a few days, bringing a false, early thaw. The snow softened, and the silence of the mountain was broken by the sound of dripping water. Haley was outside, chopping firewood, enjoying the feeling of the sun on his face, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached him. He froze, his hand instantly dropping to the colt at his hip. No one traveled the mountain in February. It was suicide. A lone rider emerged from the tree line, leading a pack horse. The man was bundled in heavy furs, his horse lathered and exhausted. As he drew closer, Haley squinted, his heart hammering a sudden, uneasy rhythm against his ribs. He recognized the man. "Haley," the rider called out, waving a thick-gloved hand. It was Sherry Pendleton. Sherry had served in the cavalry with Haley. They had bled together in the mud of Tennessee. Sherry was now a bounty hunter, a man who tracked outlaws across the Dakota and Idaho territories for coin. Haley didn't lower his hand from his gun. "Sherry, you're a long way from the plains. What are you doing up my mountain?" Sherry rode up, pulling his horse to a halt. His face was windburned and raw. He offered a weary, strained smile. "Tracking a ghost, Haley. Had to winter in Oak Haven. Heard down in the saloon that the old mountain hermit Caldwell finally took a wife. Figured I'd brave the slush to bring my congratulations." Haley's eyes narrowed. Sherry was a friend, but he was also a mercenary. And he was lying. You didn't risk a horse in 3 feet of melting snow just to say hello. At that moment, the cabin door creaked open. Josie stepped out, wiping her hands on an apron, stopping dead when she saw the stranger. Sherry's gaze snapped to her. The easy, friendly demeanor instantly vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating sharpness. He looked at Josie, then back to Haley. "Well now," Sherry said slowly, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his saddle, inches from his own rifle. "She doesn't look much like an Abigail Hodges. Her name is Josie," Haley said, stepping between Sherry and his wife, blocking the bounty hunter's view. "And you didn't answer my question, Sherry. What are you doing here?" Sherry sighed, his breath pluming in the air. He slowly reached into the heavy canvas duster he wore beneath his furs, drawing out a folded piece of paper. He tossed it into the snow at Haley's feet. "I came for the bounty." "Old friend," Sherry said quietly. Haley kept his eyes on Sherry, refusing to look down. "Go back inside, Josie," he ordered, his voice echoing with military command. Josie hesitated, then grabbed the paper from the snow before retreating to the door. She unfolded it, and Haley heard her gasp. It was a Pinkerton wanted poster. It bore a remarkably accurate sketch of Josephine. Wanted, Josephine Mercer, for grand larceny and embezzlement from the Sterling Trust, Street Lewis. Reward, $5,000. Alive, $5,000. It was a fortune, enough to buy a ranch in California, enough to make a friend turn on a friend. "A powerful man back east is very eager to have her returned," Sherry said, his tone apologetic but firm. "I didn't know it was her you married, Haley. I swear to God I didn't. But I can't walk away from that kind of money. You know I can't." Haley drew his Colt in a flash of blued steel, leveling it directly at Sherry's chest. "You're going to turn your horse around, Sherry. Right now, you ride back down this mountain, and you tell whoever hired you that the trail went cold, that she died in the winter." Sherry didn't flinch. He slowly drew his own revolver, the click of the hammer echoing loudly in the damp air. "I don't want to kill you, Haley. You saved my life at Shiloh, but I will take her. Either step aside, or we see who's faster." The wind suddenly picked up, howling through the pines, as the two old brothers-in-arms stood locked in a deadly standoff, the fiery bride standing in the doorway, a pawn in a game she had unwittingly brought to the threshold of the man she had come to love. The standoff in the slush-filled yard stretched into an agonizing eternity. The wind whipped Haley Caldwell's dark hair across his eyes, but his gaze never left Sherry Pendleton. The click of the revolver hammers seemed louder than the cracking ice of the Bitterroot spring thaw. "Sherry." Haley's voice was a low, dangerous gravel. "I won't tell you again." "Lower the iron." $5,000. "Haley," Sherry repeated, his hand trembling just a fraction. It was the only sign that the bounty hunter was fighting his own conscience. "I've got a sister in Denver who's losing her farm to the bank. That money saves her. I can't ride away from it." Before Haley could squeeze the trigger, a sharp, metallic clack-clack echoed from the cabin porch. Both men snapped their attention to the doorway. Josephine stood there, the heavy buffalo rifle pressed firmly into her shoulder, the long, octagonal barrel aimed dead at Sherry's chest. Her face was as pale as the remaining snow, but her green eyes were ablaze with a terrifying resolve. "Mr. Pendleton," Josie called out, her voice cutting through the wind like a newly honed knife. "If you shoot my husband, I will blow a hole in you so large the undertaker won't be able to find enough of you to bury." Sherry blinked, caught entirely off guard by the patrician Street Lewis accent delivering such a grisly threat. "Ma'am, this ain't your fight." "It is entirely my fight," Josie interrupted, stepping off the porch, her boots sinking into the mud. She kept the rifle perfectly steady. "And you are a fool, Mr. Pendleton. Do you honestly believe Elias Sterling is going to hand you $5,000? Sherry frowned. "A bounty is a legal contract." Josie let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Elias Sterling uses legal contracts to light his cigars. I have the ledgers, Sherry. The ones that prove he stole millions from federal railroad grants and murdered 3 men to cover his tracks. If you walk into his office with me in shackles, you become a witness to the fact that I exist and that I was caught. He will pay you with a bullet to the back of the head the moment you turn around." The logic struck Sherry like a physical blow. He looked at Haley, who had not lowered his Colt. "She's telling the truth, Artie," Haley said, using the old nickname from their army days. "You know how these rich Eastern barons operate. You're a hired gun to them. Expendable." Sherry's shoulders slumped. Slowly, deliberately, he uncocked his revolver and slid it back into his leather holster. He raised his hands, shaking his head. "Lord Almighty, I must be losing my edge to let a woman in an apron get the drop on me." Haley didn't lower his gun immediately. He stepped forward, grabbing the reins of Sherry's exhausted horse. "Get inside, before the cold freezes that thick skull of yours." Once inside the warm, fire-lit cabin, the tension remained thick. Josie brewed a pot of strong black coffee while Sherry warmed his frozen hands by the cast-iron stove. He looked around the simple, rugged room, his eyes lingering on the neatness Josie had brought to Haley's once feral existence. "You've changed him, ma'am," Sherry noted quietly, accepting a tin cup from her. "I ain't never seen Haley look at anything the way he looks at you." Josie's cheeks flushed, but she met his gaze evenly. "What happens now, Sherry? Are you going to try and take me in your sleep?" "No," Sherry sighed, taking a long drink of the scalding coffee. He looked at Haley, who was leaning against the heavy oak table, arms crossed, his revolver still resting within arm's reach. "But we have a much bigger problem than me. I wasn't the only one who saw that Pinkerton flyer in Oakhaven. Haley stiffened. Who else? Sterling didn't just put out a general bounty. He hired a retrieval team.
This
Sherry
story
said,
was posted
his
on the
voice
channel The
dropping to a
Rusty
grim
Saddle.
whisper.
Please do not
4
repost
men.
it in any form.
I saw them buying supplies at the Mercantile 2 days ago. I rode my horse half to death to beat them up the pass. 4 men don't scare me, Haley grunted. The man leading them should, Sherry replied. He looked Haley dead in the eye. It's Captain Thaddeus Blackwood. The color drained from Haley's face. The heavy oak mug in his hand cracked as his grip tightened convulsively. Josie saw the sheer terror flash across her husband's usually impassive features. Haley? Who is Thaddeus Blackwood? He was our commanding officer at Shiloh, Haley said, his voice sounding hollow, as if echoing from a deep grave. He wasn't a soldier, Josie. He was a butcher. He used to execute prisoners just to save rations. The Union Army court-martialed him and stripped him of his rank after the war, but he escaped before they could hang him. If Sterling hired Blackwood, he didn't send him to bring you back alive. The flyer said alive, Sherry countered, though he looked equally pale. That was to tempt fools like you, Haley snapped. Sterling wants the ledgers destroyed and Josie buried where no one will ever find her. Blackwood is a cleaner. Josie pressed a hand to her mouth, her heart hammering wildly. The sanctuary of the cabin suddenly felt like a wooden cage. How far behind you are they? With the snow melting and turning the trail to thick mud? Sherry calculated. They have heavy pack mules and a lot of ammunition. I'd say they'll be cresting the ridge by tomorrow afternoon. Haley pushed off the table, his eyes turning hard and cold, the eyes of a man preparing for war. Then, we have less than 24 hours to turn this cabin into a fortress. By noon the next day, the cabin in the Bitterroots had been transformed. Haley and Sherry had nailed thick, raw-cut pine planks over the windows, leaving only narrow slits for rifle barrels. They dragged the heavy oak table and overturned it against the sturdy oak door, reinforcing the iron hinges. Josie spent the morning melting snow for drinking water and tearing old cotton shirts into bandages. She didn't cry. The fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But watching Haley work with such grim, focused intensity gave her strength. Take this, Haley said, handing her a gleaming, double-barreled Remington Derringer. Keep it in your apron pocket. 2 shots. You only use it if they get inside and if I'm not standing. Josie took the small, heavy weapon, her fingers brushing his. She looked up into his scarred, handsome face. You are not going to die, Haley Caldwell. I didn't travel halfway across the country to become a widow twice in 1 year. Haley offered a rare, tight smile, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. I don't plan on it, Josie. They're coming, Sherry hissed from the front window slit, his Winchester rifle gripped tightly in his hands. Haley stepped to the window. Down in the valley, struggling through the deep, slushy drifts, were 4 riders. The man in the lead wore a long, black wool coat and a flat-brimmed hat. Even from this distance, Haley recognized the stiff, arrogant posture of Thaddeus Blackwood. Wait until they cross the creek, Haley ordered quietly, grabbing his own repeating rifle. The mud is thickest there. It will slow their horses down. The 4 men rode cautiously, their eyes scanning the tree line. Blackwood held up a hand, halting his men about 80 yards from the cabin. He spurred his horse forward a few paces and pulled a brass megaphone from his saddlebag. Private Caldwell! Blackwood's voice boomed across the valley, distorted and metallic, carrying a cruel, familiar cadence that made Haley's blood run cold. I know you're in there, boy, and I know you have Mr. Sterling's property. Send the girl out with the books, and I'll let you live to see the summer. Haley didn't answer. He shoved the barrel of his rifle through the slit in the wood. You always were a stubborn mule, Haley, Blackwood shouted, dropping the megaphone. Burn them out. The 3 men behind Blackwood instantly unslung their rifles and spurred their horses toward the tree line to find cover. Now, Haley roared. Haley and Sherry opened fire simultaneously. The heavy crack of the rifles shattered the mountain silence. One of Blackwood's men, a massive brute named Cletus, cried out as Sherry's bullet caught him in the shoulder, knocking him clean off his horse into the freezing mud. Blackwood cursed, returning fire with a pair of Colt revolvers as he violently spurred his horse behind a massive boulder. Bullets hammered into the cabin logs, tearing off chunks of bark and whistling through the air. The sound inside the cabin was deafening. Josie crouched behind the cast-in stove, her hands over her ears, praying the thick walls would hold. "Miller is flanking right," Sherry shouted over the din, jacking another shell into the chamber. "He's going for the woodpile." "I got him," Haley grunted, shifting his aim. He fired, but the sun glared off the melting snow, throwing off his shot. The bullet splintered the wood next to Miller's head, but the man kept moving, drawing closer to the blind side of the cabin. Suddenly, the smell of sulfur and smoke filled the room. "They're throwing pitch torches," Sherry yelled, coughing. "They're trying to set the roof on fire." A heavy thud echoed above them, followed by the crackle of dry pine needles catching flame. The cabin's roof, though damp from the thaw, had a thick layer of dry moss beneath the shingles. "We can't stay in here," Haley shouted, backing away from the window as smoke began to curl down from the ceiling rafters. "If the roof goes, the smoke will kill us before the fire does." "There's only one door, Haley," Sherry yelled back, firing another volley. "They have it sighted." "We step out there. We're target practice." Josie looked at the back wall of the cabin. "The root cellar. Haley, the trap door under the bed. Does it still lead to the old mining tunnel?" Haley's eyes widened. When he had built the cabin, he had constructed it over an abandoned, shallow silver prospector's shaft to use as a cold storage. It opened up into a dry ravine about 50 yards behind the cabin, completely shielded from the front yard. "Yes, help me move the bed," Haley barked. Together, the three of them shoved the heavy, fur-laden bed aside. Haley tore at the dirt floor, finding the iron ring of the trapdoor and hauling it open. A rush of cold, earthy air blasted into the smoke-filled room. "Go, Josie. Get down there," Haley commanded. Josie didn't hesitate. She grabbed the oilskin pouch containing the ledgers, shoved her derringer into her apron, and scrambled down the rough wooden ladder into the dark, freezing tunnel. "You're next, Artie," Haley shouted, firing blindly out the window to keep Blackwood's men pinned down. The roof was now fully ablaze, the heat inside the cabin becoming unbearable. Burning embers were raining down on the dirt floor. Sherry shook his head, his face smeared with soot and sweat. "Someone has to keep them pinned while you make it to the ravine. If they see you running, they'll pick you off in the snow." "I'm not leaving you behind, you stubborn fool," Haley roared. "You saved my life at Shiloh, Caldwell," Sherry yelled, shoving Haley roughly toward the trap door. "Let me pay my debt. Now get your wife down the mountain. Go." Haley looked at his old friend, seeing the fierce, unyielding determination in Sherry's eyes. With a heavy, aching heart, Haley grabbed Sherry's shoulder, giving it a bone-crushing squeeze. "Give 'em hell, Artie." Haley threw himself down the ladder, pulling the heavy trapdoor shut above him just as a massive section of the burning roof collapsed into the center of the cabin with a deafening crash. He found Josie waiting in the dark tunnel, her hand gripping his arm the moment he landed. "Where is Sherry?" she asked, panic in her voice. "He's buying us time," Haley said, his voice raw with emotion. He grabbed her hand. "Come on, keep your head down." They crawled through the damp, narrow tunnel, the muffled sounds of gunfire echoing above them. When they finally reached the exit, Haley pushed away the camouflage of dead brush and pulled Josie out into the freezing air of the ravine. They were 50 yards behind the cabin, hidden by the ridge. Haley looked back. The cabin was a roaring inferno, black smoke billowing into the crisp blue sky. The gunfire had stopped. A terrible, suffocating silence settled over the mountain. "We have to keep moving," Haley whispered, pulling Josie up the steep, snow-covered bank of the ravine. "There's a cave system 2 miles west, near the waterfall. If we can reach it before nightfall, they won't find us." They plunged into the treacherous,
This story was posted on the
knee-deep
channel The
slush of
Rusty
the melting
Saddle.
forest.
Please do not
Every
repost
step
it in any
a
form.
brutal exertion. They had no supplies. The wealthy street, Lewis Bride, and the rugged mountain man were now running for their lives, hunted by the deadliest ghosts of his past. The Bitterroot Wilderness in early March was a treacherous, deceitful landscape. What looked like solid ground was often a thin crust of ice over a 2-foot-deep puddle of freezing slush. Haley Caldwell and Josephine plunged through the dense pine forest, their breaths tearing through their lungs like jagged glass. Haley's knee, only recently healed from the wolf attack, began to throb with a vicious, grinding ache. He forced himself to ignore it, gripping his Winchester rifle in one hand and Josie's wrist in the other. "Keep your footing light," Haley rasped, his voice barely audible over the rush of the wind through the canopy. "Step exactly where I step. If Blackwood realizes we aren't in the ashes of that cabin, he'll look for broken branches and deep tracks in the mud." Josie nodded, her face pale and smeared with soot, but her jaw was set with unyielding determination. She hiked her heavy, mud-soaked skirts up, stepping carefully into the massive, displaced indentations of Haley's boots. The elegant street, Louis' socialite who had stepped off the stagecoach months ago, was entirely gone. In her place was a survivor, clutching the heavy oilskin pouch containing Elias Sterling's damning ledgers to her chest like a shield. They moved relentlessly for 3 hours. The sun began its rapid descent behind the towering, jagged peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. The temperature plummeted rapidly, freezing the slush back into deadly, slick ice. Finally, the roar of rushing water broke the silence of the woods. "We're close," Haley panted, leaning heavily against a massive cedar tree to take the weight off his agonizing leg. The Weeping Caves. They sit right behind the lower falls of Widow's Creek. They pushed through a thicket of dead mountain laurel and emerged onto the edge of a steep, rocky gorge. Below them, a torrential river of snowmelt raged, crashing over a sharp drop-off. Behind the sheer curtain of the freezing waterfall, a dark, jagged fissure opened in the rock face. The path down to the cave was nothing more than a slippery, 18-inch ledge carved into the side of the gorge. "Don't look down at the water," Haley instructed, his voice tight. "Keep your chest pressed to the rock wall. Slide your feet. Don't lift them." Josie swallowed hard, looking at the churning, white-capped rapids 50 feet below. One slip meant being crushed against the boulders. She pressed her back to the freezing stone and began to edge her way down the cliffside. The spray from the waterfall instantly soaked her clothes, biting into her skin like tiny needles of ice. When they finally slipped behind the roar of the waterfall and into the cavern, the sudden absence of the biting wind was a profound relief. The cave was deep, smelling of damp earth and ancient stone. Haley collapsed against the cavern wall, his bad leg finally giving out. He slid to the rocky floor with a harsh groan, his hand clutching his knee. "Haley!" Josie dropped to her knees beside him, her hands frantically checking him for bullet wounds she might have missed in the chaos. "I'm all right," he grunted through gritted teeth. "Just the old wolf bite acting up. The cold is seeping into the joint." Josie didn't accept his stoicism. She moved deeper into the cave, gathering handfuls of dry, brittle moss and snapping off the dead, dry lower branches of a pine tree that had long ago fallen into the cavern opening. Using the flint and steel from Haley's coat pocket, she sparked a small, hidden, smokeless fire deep in the back of the recess, shielded from the entrance by a large boulder. She returned to Haley, wrapping her arms around his broad, shivering shoulders, pulling his back against her chest to share her body heat. "I'm sorry, Josie," Haley whispered into the dark, the roar of the waterfall masking the break in his voice. "I brought you up here to keep you safe. Instead, I dragged you into a war with a butcher." "You did not drag me into anything, Haley Caldwell," Josie said fiercely, pressing a kiss to the soot-stained side of his face. I brought Elias Sterling's wrath to your doorstep. I brought Sherry, and I brought the Pinkerton bounty. If anyone is to blame, it is me." Haley turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers in the dim, flickering firelight. "You are my wife. What's yours is mine. The ledgers, the bounty, the danger, all of it. Then we fight them together," she said, her voice steady. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the gleaming, double-barreled Remington Derringer he had given her. "I have 2 shots. I won't waste them." Haley managed a tired, proud smile, reaching out to brush a damp curl from her forehead. But the moment of quiet intimacy was violently shattered. Clink. The sound of a heavy spur striking stone echoed over the roar of the water. Haley's hand flew to his Winchester, his exhaustion instantly vaporizing, replaced by cold, hard adrenaline. He motioned for Josie to stay down behind the boulder, killing the small fire with a handful of damp dirt. Plunged into near darkness, Haley crept toward the cave entrance. Through the veil of the waterfall, 2 dark figures were edging their way along the treacherous cliffside ledge. Thaddeus Blackwood had not been fooled by the fire. "He's a bloodhound," Haley muttered under his breath, recognizing the long, black wool coat. Behind Blackwood was Harlan, a wiry, vicious-looking man carrying a sawed-off shotgun. They were trapped. The only way out of the cave was the ledge the 2 killers were currently occupying. Haley raised his rifle, aiming through the rushing water. He waited until Harlan, the man in the rear, took a precarious step on a patch of slick black ice. Haley fired. The heavy bullet tore through the curtain of water and struck Harlan square in the chest. The impact threw the wiry man backward. With a scream that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the falls, Harlan plummeted off the narrow ledge, plunging into the freezing rapids below. Blackwood didn't even flinch. He instantly flattened himself against the rock wall, drawing both of his Colt revolvers. "I knew you didn't burn, Caldwell." Blackwood's voice carried a chilling, sadistic glee. "You always were too stubborn to die easy." Blackwood fired blindly through the waterfall into the cave. The bullets ricocheted off the stone walls like angry hornets, sending showers of sharp rock splinters into the air. Haley ducked behind a stalagmite, returning fire, but the muzzle flash of his Winchester gave away his position. Blackwood was inching closer to the cave entrance, using the massive boulders near the opening for cover. A surge of pure, blinding rage erupted in Haley's chest. Sherry, the man who had stayed behind to give them a chance. Haley vaulted over the stalagmite, no longer caring about cover, jacking the lever of his Winchester and firing repeatedly at the cave entrance. The heavy rounds chipped away the stone where Blackwood hid, but Haley's rifle clicked empty on the 5th shot. Before he could draw his sidearm, Blackwood stepped through the waterfall, completely soaked, a demonic grin on his face. He fired. The bullet grazed Haley's ribs, tearing through his thick leather coat and biting into flesh. Haley grunted, stumbling backward, dropping the empty rifle. Blackwood leveled his 2nd revolver directly at Haley's head. The cavern suddenly felt airless. The thunder of Widow's Creek Falls faded into a dull, distant roar in Haley's ears as he stared down the dark barrel of Thaddeus Blackwood's Colt. Warm blood soaked through his shirt, running down his side, but the pain barely registered. All he could think about was Josie and the terrible possibility that he had failed to protect her. "Where is she, Haley?" Blackwood sneered, his eyes scanning the shadows of the dripping cave. "Where's the rich girl with Sterling's books? Hand them over, and maybe I'll make your death quick." Haley wiped the blood from his mouth and forced himself to stand straighter. His revolver was trapped beneath his coat, impossible to reach before Blackwood could fire. The only chance he had was to buy Josie time. "She's gone," Haley said calmly, his voice echoing against the cavern walls. "Took the tunnel back toward Oakhaven while you were busy burning my cabin. Those ledgers are already on their way to a federal marshal." For a split second, Blackwood's grin faltered. If the books reached the law, Elias Sterling would fall, and Blackwood would hang with him. That moment of hesitation was enough. Haley lunged. Instead of grabbing for the gun, he drove his full weight into Blackwood's legs. The impact slammed both men to the stone floor. Blackwood fired wildly, the gunshot exploding through the cavern, but the bullet shattered harmlessly against the ceiling. They rolled across the rock in a brutal struggle. Blackwood struck first, smashing the heavy butt of the revolver against Haley's skull. Stars burst across Haley's vision, and his grip loosened. Blackwood scrambled back and raised the gun again. The empty chamber echoed sharply over the rushing water. Cursing, Blackwood tossed the Colt aside and drew a long hunting knife. Haley staggered upright and pulled his own blade free. The two men circled each other in the cold blue light filtering through the waterfall. Blackwood struck first.
This story was posted on the
slashing
channel The
Haley's
Rusty
forearm.
Saddle. Please do
Haley
not
ignored
repost
the
it in
pain
any
and
form.
drove forward, slamming his shoulder into Blackwood and pinning him against the jagged wall. But Blackwood twisted violently, driving a knee into Haley's wounded ribs. Haley gasped, losing his grip. Blackwood broke free and slashed toward his throat. Haley leaned back just in time, but the follow-up blow knocked him flat onto his back. Blackwood leapt on top of him, pinning his knife arm with his knee and raising the blade high. "I'll find her," Blackwood whispered coldly, "and I'll make sure she screams." Then a calm voice emerged from the shadows. "You will do absolutely nothing." Blackwood froze. Josie stepped out from behind the large boulder. Her auburn hair was wild, her emerald silk dress torn to mud-caked rags beneath Haley's oversized canvas coat. But her hands were perfectly steady. She held the double-barreled Remington Derringer, leveled directly at the back of Thaddeus Blackwood's head. "Put the knife down, Captain," Josie ordered, her Street Lewis accent clipping the syllables with icy, aristocratic precision. Blackwood let out a dark, mocking chuckle. "A Derringer, little lady? From that distance, you're just as likely to hit your husband." "My father was a banker, Captain," Josie replied, taking a deliberate step closer until the twin barrels were mere inches from Blackwood's skull. "But he also taught me that when a rabid dog attacks, you do not hesitate." Blackwood's muscles tensed. He shifted his weight, preparing to roll and throw his knife at her in one fluid motion. Haley saw the murderous shift in Blackwood's eyes. "Josie, shoot!" he roared. Josie pulled the trigger. The Derringer cracked like a whip. The .41 caliber lead ball struck Blackwood squarely in the right shoulder, shattering his collarbone. The silver hunting knife flew harmlessly out of his hand, clattering against the stone floor. Blackwood screamed in pure agony, stumbling backward toward the cave entrance. Haley didn't hesitate. Fueled by a final burst of adrenaline, he surged to his feet and hit Blackwood with the force of a runaway freight train. The momentum carried them both backward, right through the veil of the waterfall, and out onto the treacherous, slippery precipice of the ledge. Blackwood's boots hit the slick ice. He flailed wildly, grasping at Haley's leather coat. Haley braced his boots against a heavy crack in the stone, refusing to be moved. With a sickening crack, the ice beneath Blackwood's feet gave way entirely. "Caldwell!" Blackwood shrieked as gravity took hold. His grip tore free. Thaddeus Blackwood plunged 50 feet down into the churning, freezing whitewater rapids of Widow's Creek. His body struck a jagged boulder beneath the surface with a dull thud, and within seconds, the violent current swept him away into the dark. Haley stood on the ledge, his chest heaving. A gentle hand touched his back. He turned to find Josie, tears finally streaming down her soot-stained face. He dropped to his knees and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her muddy hair. 3 days later, the spring sun broke over the Bitterroot Mountains. Haley and Josie, battered but alive, rode into Oakhaven and handed the oilskin pouch of ledgers to the federal marshal. Within hours, the telegraph lines buzzed with the damning evidence. As they stepped out of the marshal's office, a familiar, hunched figure limped across the muddy street. Haley stopped dead. "Sherry," Haley breathed. Sherry Pendleton looked terrible, his left arm in a heavy sling. but he offered a weak, pained smile. "Told you I was too stubborn to die in the mud, Haley. Local doctor patched me up." Sherry reached into his good pocket, pulled out the Pinkerton bounty poster, and struck a match. He watched the paper burn to ash before dropping it into a puddle. "Word on the wire is, Elias Sterling was arrested in Street Lewis this morning. The bounty is void, Mrs. Caldwell. You're a free woman." Josie smiled, slipping her hand into Haley's scarred grip. "We both are." The embers of their ruined pasts gave way to the sturdy foundation of a new life. Haley and Josephine Caldwell rebuilt their cabin on the same ridge, its timber walls stronger, its hearth warmer. Elias Sterling's empire crumbled entirely when the Ledgers reached the Chicago Marshals, ending his reign of terror and clearing the bounty on Josephine's head. Sherry Pendleton, having survived the fire with a nasty scar and a newfound conscience, delivered the federal pardon himself before heading south to buy his sister's farm. Haley, once a solitary ghost haunting the Bitterroots, finally laid his battlefield demons to rest. He had sent for a practical servant to merely survive the brutal Idaho winter, but fate delivered a fiercely resilient partner. Josephine traded her emerald silk for rugged buckskin, a city girl forged into a mountain queen. Together, they conquered the wilderness, their fiery love forever unyielding.